Hi everyone, welcome back to Blender Halt. Today we're going to be doing a bit of a refresher video. So I'll be recording a series of refresher workshop type videos just to help refamiliarize you with the different areas of the Blender interface and the functions they provide. So this will apply whether you're coming back to Blender after a bit of a hiatus, or whether you're new to Blender and you've already gotten used to the basics about how to construct the interface, how you want to see it. And this will be a bit of a kind of conversational workshop video because that's how we do things on this channel. I have other Blender channels, such as just the Curtis Holt channel, which has a bit of a mix of content types, but for this one I like to imagine that we're kind of sitting together in a classroom. Maybe you've got a notepad and a drink and I'm just messing around with Blender. Anyway, in this video let's start with the 3D view. Now obviously, for some contextual information, my startup file here looks nothing like the regular startup file for Blender, which is far more limited, much more heavier in terms of screen space on the 3D view, and I believe the theme is also slightly different. I've got a custom one that I call Steel because I liked having slightly more kind of pale bluish colors and a bit of a darker theme. But that's one of the wonderful things about Blender, is it's just immense customization, which is really something I wish more softwares would have. So obviously what we've got here is our 3D view, and at the moment I'm in the rendered mode. So typically if I hold down Z, and I should also say that when I'm using hotkeys in this video, your hotkeys may be slightly different because again I have customized workflows for how I do my own work. But that's also kind of why I say you should somewhat be familiar with how the Blender interface works when jumping into these videos, because if I was doing it from a complete beginner perspective, then we would reset everything to factory defaults and do it that way. So the 3D view is naturally where you get to explore the content of your scene, and there are several ways of visualizing the content inside of it. Typically you're going to be working from the solid view most of the time. That's if you're doing regular scene composition and modeling and kind of working in the different modification modes for the objects. So obviously if I'm actively modeling and I'm swapping between different modes, I'm going to be spending my time here. In some cases, when in the rendered mode, certain things won't update. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you do like working from the rendered mode, maybe it's more viable if you're in a rendering engine like Eevee rather than Cycles, although I'm not going to wait for the shaders to calculate. And also, as you can see, the lighting I have at the moment is set up for the Cycles rendering engine, because in this particular scene I'm using what I would call emissive bounce lighting, or some people might call mesh lighting, where it's coming from material sources. So I'm going to keep it on Cycles. But yeah, if you're making changes, maybe even in geometry nodes, which can get a little bit more finicky with the data structures of objects, sometimes you won't see a change. Another example might be sculpting. Sometimes you'll be sculpting on an object in the rendered mode and you won't actually see any changes happen, and then when you swap back to the solid view, you'll see an update. That's because the update cycle for mesh information is not exactly the same between modes. When you're moving into the rendered mode, Blender constructs what it calls the BVH, I believe, which you can kind of just think of as like a memory structure for what needs to be shown. Now that aspect is a more technical side that I'm not too familiar with, but I believe there's more information about it on the documentation. But really the main thing you need to remember there is that solid view is like your master view. That's where you're going to get the most accurate representation for the data in your scene. So that's our common baseline. Another thing I'll know about the 3D view is that if I'm pressing Shift and A, which I use to bring up the add menu, features like this in Blender are very context dependent. So there is consistency. We know that Shift and A adds something to where we're working. So for example, Shift A, mesh plane, then yay, there's a plane in the scene, woohoo. And then for the sake of consistency, if I was in the shader nodes, I could press Shift A, input, color, converter, texture, whatever, and this would be adding nodes. So Shift A for add, if you think about it that way. So the context system is important for helping Blender know where we're working. And it's also a really important thing to keep in mind when making add-ons for Blender, because you need to learn how the context system works to know how to present functionality to users, or change the functionality of an add-on, adapting to where the user is and what they're doing. So let's have a look around the interface. And I should also note that these buttons here are extra because of an add-on that I have and I've made along with a co-contributor called Modular Workspaces. So let me see if I can just disable that quickly. So there we go. That will hide the extra buttons just to make it a bit less confusing. So we should now have very similar interfaces. I'm just going to quickly put a cube in the world again so we have something to play with. So along the top left, we have information about the scene. This is optional to show. And the information about the scene coincides with whether overlays are enabled or disabled. I'm using a hotkey to turn these on and off, which is quite convenient to have. But to manually do it, you'll see that in the top right of the user interface here, there's this button with two overlapping circles, filled circle and an empty one, and that is your overlay button. So you can click on that to show and hide. And again, the wonderful thing about the Blender interface is there is a massive amount of customization. So for example, if I disable and enable the statistics tick box, that's going to give us this information piece here, which is actually quite handy, especially if, say, you're working on individual props and you want to be considerate of optimization and vertex count and stuff like that. If you're working on a single item, it's really handy because, depending on what you're clicking on, it will show you relevant metrics. so you can keep an eye on your poly count and stuff like that. Now, there are all different kinds of things we can enable and disable in the overlays that are going to be differentially relevant depending on what you're doing. Although, I will say, if you're confused about why one particular thing isn't appearing or disappearing in your scene, so let me bring out, like, I have a camera and an empty here, and they both have gray lines. When in doubt, it will probably fall under the category of extras. You see how both the empty object and the camera are disappearing under extras. So though there are toggleable options for most things individually, some things collectively fall under extras. So another thing about the outline menu is it's great for customizing your viewport experience, especially if you want to present information about your scene to someone. For example, if you're sharing your artwork online, it's quite good practice to show not just the render, but also the 3D view, and ideally with a wireframe. We didn't always have this level of customization in Blender, especially back in the 2.7 series before the big jump to 2.8, which basically had a mass overhaul for the Blender interface in 2018, I believe. But now we have all lovely features, so that can enable geometry, and that will provide us with a wireframe where we can control the threshold of its appearance and its opacity. So you see how we can get very subtle wireframe lines if we like. So not even just for presentation, it can help you get an understanding of the flow of things in your scene without being too overwhelming. You can also enable face orientation, and this is useful for seeing whether you have any flipped normals on meshes. That would be especially useful for sculpting, because sometimes if you're doing a messy sculpt, or maybe if you're correcting geometry or doing retopology, where you're starting from empty space and making like a quad structure around something, it's not always immediately obvious whether your normals for the faces are pointing in the right direction. And if you're new to the modeling scene, normal basically just means what way is the face pointing, because obviously this is not a real physical space, so the objects inside of Blender don't necessarily have a physical thickness. So when we're calculating what light's bouncing off, it tends to be only on one direction of the face. There are engines which kind of handle this in different ways, but it's important to consider. Might also be able to demonstrate this if I press F3 to search. I'm in edit mode, by the way, and I can flip normals. So now I've manually flipped one of the normals and we'll see it's appearing in red. So that is giving us a good indication of whether we have any issues in our scene in regards to the face orientation. And again, in a render view, it's not always apparent. It will depend on the particular renderer you're using and the shader settings applied, but it's an important thing to keep in mind. Actually, as I'm rotating around now in the solid view, you can kind of see it's wrong just based on how the shading is inverted. So I'm just going to flip that back, and now it's accurate again. You'll develop an eye for it over time if you do a lot of modeling. It's not always obvious to see. Okay, back in the top left, we have controls for how we want to see the orientation. So if I rotate the cube, if we have it on default, it's going to be global, which means that our gizmo is pointing in the relevant X, Y, and Z directions globally. If I set it to local, then it's going to be pointing along kind of the upward Z normal direction, so we can translate it along that way. And it's quite synonymous with the transform orientations in the middle here. To be honest, I'm not sure why they would be different here. I assume it's because of this is a tool-based orientation, and that's just a general orientation, because as you see, if I set that back to default and then set this to local, then it does the same thing again, even though they're separate. So now that's on local, that's on global. Typically, I would just say I never use this one on the left. I always just use the center one if I'm manipulating things. And this is especially useful when it comes to modeling, because if we have the object where the rotation is different from how it originally was, you oftentimes want to preserve that rotation, because if we go into the edit mode, then you'll see that we'll be able to model in relation to that rotation. But if we went back to the object mode, then press something like Control A and applied the rotation, which resets it or normalizes it, then we lose that rotation, so we can only work from the global perspective now or the normal of the face. So that is a thing to keep in mind. See, we're on local and it's looking like a global gizmo because it's going up and down. If you did have a face and you still wanted to move along the face direction, we can go to normal and it will consider the normal face as well. So even if you do lose the rotation of the object, you still have an option for some kind of local manipulation anyway. So the next section we'll look at is this drop down for transform pivot point. So this is very useful if we have multiple objects. So we've got two selected. We'll see that there's a central point here. I can click and drag that around, or I can manipulate it with any other hotkey. So I'm double tapping R to roll it like a gizmo. Scale, and it will scale around that point. And essentially everything is done around that center point. So that's what we call the median point, because it's kind of like well, the median. You can also kind of think about it like the center of mass or center of gravity, although there's no physics going on here. So just think about it as like the average space. Alternatively, we have individual origins. So what this does is, where we see the tiny dots representing the origins of each object, if we rotate around now, they're individually going to rotate around those rather than, back to median point, rotating together. The other option is 3D cursor. So now, if I rotate, it's going to rotate around the 3D cursor as a point. This is extremely useful when it comes to finite modeling, because you can have the 3D cursor set to a vertex point and effectively use that as like a temporary storage. You can move the origin to that, you can move vertices there, and then move the 3D cursor along and keep it in temporary storage. It's basically like copying a location in 3D space, which you can like paste to another object elsewhere. So for example, if I press Shift S and do selection to cursor, then both of the objects are going to move to the 3D cursor. Alternatively, if I click on the left object and then do Shift S, cursor to selected, it will move there. And then, for example, I can click this one, Shift S, selection to cursor, and it will move it to that position. So you can see that it's basically like a memory storage. And then great as well, you can imagine for robotics, say we have the 3D cursor around a specified axis, then we can move things around that. Then it's great for helping you set up the rigging process for that as well. Then we have other options for bounding box center and active element. So active element, in Blender, you can have multiple objects selected, but only one is going to be active. And it's the last one you select, which is why the color is different. Again, in my custom theme, color may be different to the default theme, but for me, the active one is yellow, while ones which are just selected are blue. So in this case, it doesn't matter how many are selected, it's the one that's active, which is going to be used as the pivot point. And then bounding box center. Bounding box is more appropriate for thinking about physics, but imagine that there's a box containing everything. Sometimes that box has to be quite large if things are like at different corners, but if you imagine there's a box containing everything, then the center point of that is going to be your bounding box center. So if I put something out at a weird direction, then the bounding box is going to be somewhere weird here in the middle, because you imagine that box has to stretch out to contain that. Whereas if I go to the median point, it's going to be a bit further down, because that's the average, if that makes sense. We have a heavier distribution of things over here, so it's more likely that this will be the average point, whereas back to the bounding box, it's going to be somewhere more spatially central. Typically, I just stick with the median point, and individual origins were useful. And again, 3D cursor is also handy. All right, so next up we have snapping. We can see here that we got the magnet icon, and if I enable that, when I move the cube, it's going to be snapping to individual increments. But the snap mode doesn't have to be just increment based, and also if I have that disabled, and I move it, if I hold down the control key, that's going to temporarily enable snapping. Another thing to note is that if you are holding control to do the snapping, if you then hold shift, it will do it at even smaller increments. So I believe, for example, this would be 1 meter and then 0.1 meters by comparison. And again, that is pretty essential when you're doing modeling because it applies everywhere. So I can move this vertex, hold control and shift, and do small increments or larger increments. And it's also, another important note, zoom dependent. So if I zoom in, then the increments of control are going to get smaller and the increments of shift control even finer. And in this case, in the perspective mode, it's always going to stick to 1 meter. But if I then go into orthographic, I just pressed 1 on my numpad, then it's going to be smaller. So it does have this adaptive behavior. It's just one thing to keep in mind. We can change the behavior for the snapping in this drop-down menu next to the magnet icon. And there are a lot of options. We won't go through all of them, but as you can see, we can have it snap to increment like we've just been seeing, or actually snap to the grid. So this one is more finite for modeling. So see that as I'm in an orthographic mode and I'm holding control and moving it around, it is specifically snapping to grid. So that is fantastic, especially if you need to do precise things on the grid, and if you know what the scale of the grid is. But like I said, the grid itself changes depending on our zoom level. So we can zoom way far out and then it's going to be snapping pretty high. Likewise, there is vertex. So this is great for retopology if you need to snap onto something else. So as I'm moving a vertex and holding control and hovering over other vertices in the scene, it's going to snap to that. So as you can see, it's going to move there. So you can imagine how fantastic that is. So you have a sculpted object and you're trying to retopologize, so build new geometry around it. That's a really complex surface you can snap on top of. Likewise, we can also do edges, and it behaves the same way for edges. You can pick anywhere along an edge. And faces, same thing again. You can snap onto a face. Again, the face one is probably more useful for sculpting because you have more of a surface area to click on. And then we have volume, so it doesn't really matter just as long as there's a volume there in the physical space. Edge center, so the center of edges, makes sense, right? And then edge perpendicular, which I never use. You also have the option to align the rotation to target, but that doesn't matter so much for the vertices. But you can see that if something has a normal direction, you see the little yellow line sticking out, it's going to try and align it properly. This would apply more if you were, say, snapping an actual object. So let's say we make this obvious that it's got a point, and let me scale this down and apply the scale. If I move it and hold Control, you see how our pointy cube is trying to match the orientation now. So that's great for scattering or applying objects. Imagine that I've got like a bunch of barnacles that I'm trying to snap to something. In this case, it's falling through, but we also need to consider things like the position of the origin. So the origin's in the middle. Let me bring that out. Click on the bottom face, cursor to selected, object mode, right click, set origin, origin's 3D cursor. I know I'm being quick here. So the origin's on the bottom now. If I hold Control, then you're going to see how we can basically just place things on top of anything else. All right, so I'm going to reset that to increment. And what else? We've got proportional editing. So if I press Control and 4 and then apply this subdivision surface modifier, so what we've got here is a subdivided cube, which becomes round. And I'm going to go into the edit mode on vertex, and we'll see that I can, just move vertices around, but it's only moving an individual vertex, which is not super useful. If I wanted to make some wider sweeping changes to this object, then I'm going to need to use proportional editing, which can be enabled with O as the default hotkey, but you can just click on it, and we'll see that the drop down has a variety of curve options. So if I then moved this vertex, by default we're going to see quite a lot move, but while we're moving it, if you scroll forwards, it's going to reduce the influence. And if I scroll backwards, it's going to increase the influence. So what that lets you do is, rather than moving things individually everywhere, is you can select and then start pushing things around. And in a way, it kind of becomes a different type of mesh sculpting, where we're kind of just pinching things as we go to get the shape that we want. And imagine if you had to do this individually with each vertex, it would just be impossible. So that's why these tools are super useful. From the drop down, the different types of curves provide different behaviors. So if we do sharp, it's going to have a much sharper fall off, as you can see, pinching it in and out. There's also constant, right, which does kind of what it says. It's just a single drop off between the circular radius. There's also random. So what this does is it randomly pulls things out. So this will probably look better on a mesh which is much more subdivided. So I give that even more geometry and then pull one out. There you go. We see like the random pattern there. Now you can control the proportional size there in the interface, but like I said, it's easier just kind of scrolling and doing it. But smooth is typically the one that you use a lot of the time. What does that look like in the rendered view now? Just going to apply the material to it for fun. So now we have some kind of like abstract-y shape. So next up we have selectability and visibility. Typically I don't really use this menu because if I want something to be selectable or not, I will just modify parameters in the outliner, which we'll come to in a different video. But it's quite convenient to access. If you want to be able to choose whether you want to select meshes, you can enable and disable that. So I'm trying to click on the mesh now and nothing's happening. I can click on the empty, but not the mesh. So it's a quick, convenient way of locking things. And you can also hide and enable different categories from there as well. So if you don't want to mess around with the outliner, but you do want to modify the status of different categories, you can do that. Oh, and that's another note as well. You don't have to click things individually if you want to do many things at once. If you click and hold and then drag down, it will apply what you're doing to everything in the list. So that's a little convenience factor of the Blender interface. Now there's also a quick button for X-ray. What X-ray does is pretty self-explanatory. It just makes things kind of transparent in the way that you can see everything rendered through it. Now that's useful for if you've got many overlapping elements in a scene. For example, if you're doing like a building and you need to see what's inside of the rooms of the building, then the X-ray is convenient for that. Now additionally in the top right, we finally have these rendering options. So there are 4 main buttons representing wireframe, right, which is great. Also really great from orthographic views. So again, I'm just pushing the number buttons on the numpad, which you may or may not have depending on your keyboard, but there is a way to emulate it, I believe, but I've never had to use that. Emulate numpad. Main 1 to 0 keys act as numpad ones. So yeah, that's useful if you're on a laptop. Yeah, so as I'm pressing 1, 2, 3 on the regular keyboard, that will emulate it. Actually, I'm going to keep that on because the number buttons really annoy me because I think by default, they're like for enabling and disabling collections, which I never use. So I'm actually just going to keep that active because I'd rather it just change the view than mess up my collection status. So woohoo, nice change. Anyway, the next one is for the solid view, obviously, and I've still got the wireframe active in the overlay, so let me just disable that. Then the next one is viewport shading. So this is technically powered by Eevee, but it's typically for previewing props, if you want to think about it that way. If we press the drop down with this mode active, it's giving us an HDRI with which we can use to preview the object. So it's like a half rendering mode for visualizing the objects in our scene. So imagine that we had a complex texture on it, we would be able to see the reflection of the HDRI. If you don't know what an HDRI is, it's basically like, imagine there's a light image, like a light source wrapping around the space. So it's like a quick simulant for an environment that's not actually there. You know, like on your phone, if you do like a panoramic image where you can take like a full 360, it's like that, but applying the light from that image to an object. And then lastly, the last button is the full rendering mode. So in this case, for me, it's cycles. And you'll notice that the drop down, as we click it, it's been different for the different modes. So if I go back to wireframe, we will have wireframe options here. We can choose how much the X-ray is, or whether to even have the X-ray active. For the solid view, we have options to change, like the color and how everything looks. So we can even give things random colors, which looks great when there are many objects in the scene. People use that quite a lot. We can even give it a cavity. So this is great for sculpting objects where we can see whether there are high or low regions. So if I change the cavity type to both, it might be hard to see how like the edges are highlighting, and we can give what is effectively a simulation of what we call ambient occlusion, which gives things extra shadowing. So you can see that it's really helping to like highlight the high and low areas. So if I did go into sculpt mode and then start sculpting away, you can see where there's a lower region now and a higher region as I sculpt that on. So those settings are provided by the drop down here in the solid view. And we have different lighting options. So we've got studio, matte cap, and flat. So flat is naturally very flat type of lighting. The matte cap, a little bit like the HDRI actually, but for a surface instead, is a simulation of a material. So it's literally just an image that's made to look like it has lighting, but it's projected on everything. So no matter where we look around the object, the lighting is going to appear in the same place. In this case, we can see that the lighting is kind of central, slightly up. So wherever we look, the lighting is going to apply centrally for us. And Studio is kind of similar, but we have a few different options for that. Then we have like more custom control for it. Another interesting thing to use in the solid view is the shadow option. So that's going to imagine that there's like a sunlight source and help you to kind of visualize the depth in your scene. So it doesn't always make sense in every scene, but it can look quite nice, particularly again, if you've got like a character. Actually, I have one available. So if you don't have like the typical rendering capacity to like do a full-on render, you can still get a really nice viewport capture just with the shadow there. You see what I mean? So maybe if I go to the overlays and hide bones, I can maybe go to view and viewport render image, and it's going to give me a render of our viewport here. That's another tip as well, by the way. If you didn't know that, you can capture images of the viewport by going to view, render viewport image. And I believe the resolution it takes is based on your, let me go to the output settings. Yeah, the output settings in the properties editor. I've got mine set to 2000 by 2000 pixels, but if I did 1920 by 1080, for example, which is a regular ultra wide, and then I grab the image, it's going to try and apply it to that scale instead. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. I like to, by default, work from a square, like a 1:1 aspect ratio of 2000 by 2000, but I'll typically change that as I do different types of renders. But it's one thing to keep in mind, like if people are asking for proof images that something you make actually is from Blender, then you can actually make quite a nice viewport renders like that just by adjusting the values in the solid shading settings and then capturing one. From here, we also have other elements of the interface, like I can click and drag this gizmo around in the top right. That's going to rotate the scene. Maybe that's useful if you don't have like a middle mouse button available, which I'm using to rotate around. Also, we have more click and drag options for zooming in and out, panning, you can toggle the camera view, and switch between perspective and orthographic. Now, also in the 3D view, if I press the T and N keys, then it's going to bring up the tool panel. From here, we can choose different gizmos. So by default, I like to have mine on move, which is why we can see the arrows. If the arrows are missing, you might not realize that you have it set on select mode. So at the moment, it's on select but box mode, and you'll see as I click on things, there's no gizmo there. The gizmo can disappear for a number of reasons. So it might be because you're in the wrong tool, but it might also be because the timeline is playing. So a lot of people don't realize that they accidentally press space, which I think by default plays the timeline. And we can actually see that if I open the timeline editor. So watch this. We've got the gizmo here. I've got move selected, but if I play it, then the move disappears. So that's another little gotcha moment. If you think that you've got the right tool selected, but you still can't see the gizmo, it might be because your timeline is playing, but you might not have the editor open, so you don't realize it. But you'll notice if it says anim player down there at the bottom of the screen. So if you click that, then the gizmo should reappear. So we've got the cursor tool, so this lets us set the 3D cursor. Now, if you press shift and right click, I believe that's what I've got mine set to anyway, that will also let you place the 3D cursor anywhere, and it will appear over whatever object you're hovering over. Another little note about 3D view navigation is that when you're rotating around any point, there is an invisible point in 3D space that you're rotating around. I'm always changing that point to help my navigation, so I know what I'm focusing on. And the way you do that is by holding Alt and pressing the middle mouse button, and it's going to move that point to whatever you're hovering over. So if I want to work on the face, I do that. I hold Alt, middle mouse button, and go where I want to in the scene. So carrying on with the tools, we've got the move tool, we've got the rotation tool. Oh, the guy's rigged. So I'm actually moving the mesh away from the bones. If you're wondering why that's happening, we can visualize that if I turn the bones back on. See that? So the bones are staying where they are. If I had the armature object selected and then did it, it would work. But AO, kind of funny. Ooh, spooky. But then we've also got the scale tool. So again, likewise, if I grab the armature and then scaled, that would work. And then we have transform, which applies everything. So we have access to the rotational gizmo, the movement, and the scale options. So I'm just going to move that guy back to center a little bit. And I'll give him a different material. Mess around with the scene slightly before we carry on. Sorry, I just got a tiny bit distracted by lighting then. All right, so next we have the annotation tool, and what this lets you do is draw, and the drawing will actually be visible only when the overlays are active. Also, if you hold down D and then hold right click, you can erase. So the annotation tool doesn't actually need to be active for you to use it, because like I said, D, if you're holding that down, you can left click and draw, and right click to erase. So you can point to things, you can write something, and then you can erase it. But it's kind of handy just for making notes to yourself or annotating things for others to see and understand. But notice that it's only kind of relevant to where you are. You can decide where the placement is. So we see we've got placement to 3D cursor. You can do it to surface as well. So as you're drawing, it's going to stick to surface. But notice that as I drew away from the character, it moved back to the light catcher behind. So if you are concerned about the placement, keep that in mind. If I do it from the view, it's going to stick to where I am rotating around. So maybe that's okay, like if you know your view is going to be in the same place, but then you'll see that as you move around, it's going to stick there. So if you do want it to be spatially remembered, then you've got to say shift right click for the 3D cursor, make sure the placement's on the 3D cursor, and then, you can scribble around, and that will try and keep it localized in the right place. Let me go to the solid view. You can see that a bit easier. So yeah, for spatial drawings, always shift right click, and you'll see how it's kind of useful for like helping you to plan out the scene like that. And it doesn't matter how far you are from it. If you do the D and right click, you can erase it from the view, and that's all great. Next up, we've got measuring. So if you are doing, maybe architectural things or layouts, you can draw to put measurements in the scene. Now, there's more power to this feature that I'm not too sure about, so I could actually click on the middle point there, and it will give me an angle between two things as well. It's going to try and stick that point to wherever you place it in the scene. It doesn't automatically snap, but I believe if you hold down Control, then it will snap it to a surface. Yeah, so you click, drag, hold Control, and you can put it on a corner of an object, and that will help you to get the measurement. And then lastly, there's a tool for add cube, but if you click and hold, you can add other things. This might be nice again, kind of reminds me of SketchUp, if anyone ever used that 3D software. It's cool for just quickly blocking things out. You can also snap to surfaces as well. So if we're going up, I can hold Control and hover over another object to try and align the height, so that is a bit more like SketchUp. So if you want to make sure things are the same height, you can do that as well. Now, the other options up here, the final options, they're just a variety of settings that are available, quick things to add, shortcuts, etc. I mean, the add one is pretty much exactly the same as holding Shift-A add, and then we can also change the editor up here. So I think they'll actually leave it for this video, for this little refresher on the 3D view. Hopefully you found it useful. If you made it this far through the video, remember to subscribe. You can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/CurtisHolt, or check out my Blender tools at curtisholt.online/store. Otherwise, if you made it this far through the video, put some kind of tool-related emoji in the comments. If you're in Windows, you can press the Windows key and the period key to bring up an emoji keyboard. And if you do that, it will show me which of you did make it this far. So thanks for watching, everyone. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.